Domestic Hunger and Poverty Working Group and that particular program in the division. And as a part of that work, we have organized a rural crisis issue team made up of persons across the membership of the National Council who are involved in land policy and rural concerns for our different members. So we welcome you. The Rural Crisis Issue Team welcomes you to the Food, Famine, and Agricultural Policy Forum of the gathering this afternoon, this 22nd of May, 1988. We have a lot to talk about, and we have two very competent people to share with us this afternoon. Frances Moore Lappé from the Institute for Food and Development Policy in San Francisco, and Mark Ritchie, who's the trade analyst for the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. But first, I want to introduce two or three people that are here with me from the Rural Crisis Issue Team or from the Working Group on Domestic Hunger and Poverty. To my right is Edward Pinnock, Jerry, who is the Associate Director of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, whose offices are in Atlanta, Georgia, and in Epes, Alabama. Their rural development farm is in Epes. And Jerry has been a consultant on the Rural Crisis Issue Team now for a number of years, and is a strong advocate, as you might guess, for black farm retention. And as we go through the studies of our concerns for the loss of farmers, we know that black farm loss is going at double the rate of white farm loss in this country. Max Glenn is here, who is the executive director of the Oklahoma Conference of Churches. Max is at the back and one of the related members of the Rural Crisis Issue Team. And the Reverend Marvin Marsh is the vice chairperson of the Working Group on Domestic Hunger and Poverty. He's also at the back, where we have had some papers ready for you to pick up as you came into our meeting. I'm not going to take up any more time because I want us to hear the two people that have come to lead us in our better understanding of food, famine, and agricultural policy, and then have some time for questions at the end of the forum. First, Frances Moore Lappé, co-director of the Institute for Food and Development Policy, and a person who has written many books that we have all used as part of our understanding and research for the concerns of food self-reliance in the global village.
Thank you, Mary Ellen. I usually begin my talks with a bit of a story about how it is that I came to be in that particular place, meaning what was the path of my life that led me here. But being here actually has a particular twist to it, because where I am is where I began. I grew up in Fort Worth. In fact, exactly 25 years ago, I was in my little pinstripe dress as a money changer at Six Flags Over Texas. So, in a more serious vein, I'm delighted to be here because it is since coming home I can see people I haven't seen for several years, and they are part of the reason that I am here. Sitting on the front row, Mary and Harry Evans are people who helped my parents found a church in Fort Worth, a Unitarian church in the 1950s in Fort Worth, which was quite a courageous undertaking. And certainly it is the influence of them, my parents, and that church that is part of the reason that I am here today. I would like, though, to take you a few other big steps in my own life that will help you understand, I hope, why I'm saying what I'm saying today, because while the title of this group has to do with food and famine, what I want to present is an overarching, in a sense, my own personal philosophy that I think hopefully will be useful as we talk about these specific issues. But how did I get from world hunger, in a sense, or how did I get from even the pinstripe dress at Six Flags to where I am? And what I have to say today, I am a child of the 60s. I graduated from college in '66 and went to work with people in Philadelphia who I believed were suffering the most in our current economic system. I tried to get people on welfare what they were entitled to under the welfare laws. And I was convinced, though, as the months and years went by, that no matter what I succeeded in doing each day, I was not addressing the underlying causes of their suffering. The woman I work most closely with died of a heart attack at about the age I am now. And I was convinced that she died of the stress of poverty, but I didn't know how what I was doing addressed the cause of her death. But I went on doing what I was doing because I didn't know what else to do. Until the year 1969, when at that point I was a graduate student in California and I was still doing community organizing work. But I projected my life forward on that trajectory that I was on, and I said, no. I still did not know how the path that I had chosen addressed the underlying causes of the suffering that seemed to be intensifying and seemed to be more clearly than ever needless. So I stopped doing anything, and I stopped trying to save the world until I could answer more clearly the question of why I had chosen the path that I had. And I was terrified, actually, and I stayed home a lot in terror that somebody would ask me what I was doing and I wouldn't have an answer. But now people kind of laugh and they say, Frankie, are you serious? In Berkeley, California, in the late 60s, somebody would really have asked you, what are you doing? Maybe they would have asked you, what are you into? But I didn't have an answer to that either. So what happened, and it turned out to be the most important decision of my life, I made this vow not to do anything else again until I understood these more fundamental questions. And so what happened is that I started listening. And for the first time, I discovered that there were questions inside me. You see, I had grown up literally next door in the 50s, going to a very poor public high school. And so when I left Texas to go to Indiana to college, I was convinced that anyone outside the borders of this state was an Eastern intellectual. And I was utterly terrified. And I went through college trying to trick the professor into not discovering that I was really the dumb Texas female that I knew that I was. And I didn't learn a lot under those circumstances. And it wasn't until I started listening and discovered that there were real questions coming from inside me that I started learning. And I was influenced by the ecology movement that was born, Earth Day 1970. I was influenced by the limits to growth debate, by books like The Population Bomb. And I intuited that if I could just make sense out of the food dilemma, out of hunger, if I could just understand why are people starving, that this would maybe help me penetrate the most complex economic and political problems that I hadn't been able to penetrate. So I started reading everything I could on food, believing that food was universal and yet it was personal. It linked us to the earth and to each other, if I could just make sense out of it. So I buried myself in an agricultural library. Actually, at Berkeley, nobody, at that point anyway, ever went to this library, and so I wasn't too afraid of being asked what I was doing. And I developed my research technique, which I have used for the last 20 years, which I call following my nose. And by that I meant I didn't know where I was headed, but I had to answer some questions. And in this process, you know some of this, you know my work at all, you know that out of those initial note-taking sessions in the basement library at Berkeley came Diet for a Small Planet in 1971. But the strangest thing happened to me in the early 70s. I wanted to tell people about the political and economic roots of world hunger, but instead I sort of became the Julia Childs of the soybean circuit. And I was asked to go on any number of TV talk shows as long as I would bring the beans and rice and tell people how to lose weight and save money on the coming world food crisis. But I went on these talk shows and I tried to make the best of it until the year 1974. And I'm sure many of you remember that year who have been working as food activists in this field for as long as and I know many of you have. That was the year of the World Food Conference. That was the year that Henry Kissinger went to Rome and said, no child shall go to bed hungry in 10 years. And government leaders, corporate executives, Earl Butts, gathered in Rome to draw up a blueprint for how to end world hunger. And I went to Rome, as I look back, thinking that I would still rub elbows with people who knew more than I did. But what happened was something that I had not anticipated, because I still remember that flight back from Rome in November 1974, and I can only describe it this way. I felt like Superwoman, and yet I was utterly terrified. It was a strange mix of emotions, because what had happened to me in that 1 week, meeting the likes of the Earl Butts, etc., of the world, I realized that those experts up there that I suppose I had still mystified, you know, those people up there who were supposed to be taking care of business, I realized that they're not. If you realize there's nobody up there taking care of business, What does that mean for each of us? It means that it is both ultimately liberating and it is terrifying, because the answers lie with us, those who have not been so schooled by the institutions of power, that we are able to look with fresh eyes, that we can ask the appropriate questions. And that's what I realized those in Rome were unable to do. Very simply, as I get into the heart of my talk, let me just say what the realization was. And of course, I was putting this together in my own work, but somehow being there was the final sort of a lifting of the veil of mystification, because I saw that those leaders gathered in Rome who were defining the problem of the world had defined the problem of global hunger as an equation out of balance. Here's the equation. Over here are resources, food and land. Over here are people. And now the problem simply is that we don't have enough on this side and we have too many on this side, right? It's so simple. All we must do is use their chemicals, use their improved seeds, etc., to up the production over here. And on this side, we certainly must limit births so that we can bring this side into balance with this side. It makes perfect sense until you look at the real world. So if you look at the real world, as we know, that on this side, in fact, many of the most productive countries, those that took the Green Revolution advice, many South Asian countries, many Asian countries that have been successful in increasing production. I take two examples, India and Pakistan, considered great production success stories. More children died of hunger in 1986 in India and Pakistan than all the 46 sub-Saharan African countries put together. So it begins to crack, doesn't it, this neat connection between production going up and hunger going down. I learned in recent years, this most recent figure I can give you, that just in the world's surplus, I'm not talking about production, that which the market cannot absorb of the world's grain that is produced, if you took 1% of that, 1% of it is enough to eliminate the hunger that so depletes the bodies of our world's children that 18 million of them die every year. 1% of the surplus. Begin to crack this view of an equation out of balance. And on the other side, of course, we've come to see that there is no correlation in the world between density of people per acre and hunger. So as you look at this neat, simple definition of the problem, it collapses in face of reality. And what happens? When our simple models collapse, we have to go right back to the drawing board, don't we, and start at square one. And in a sense, what my talk will be today is my attempt over the last 15 years to mix my metaphors here, my images, from this balance to this proverbial onion. What I hope to do is to peel away the layers, at least as I have been trying to do it myself, for myself, to understand how can this be. We go back to the drawing board to understand these complex problems. Well, my sense of it is that whenever one is trying now to understand something so complex, it helps to start close to home. I think that as we think about world hunger, global agriculture, and famine, that it helps to come right back home. And this is what I want to be doing, primarily focusing on the realities in America, because my thesis is that the cause of hunger in America is the same as the cause of hunger in the quote-unquote third world. So we have to start at home with a very unflinching look at the reality here. We have to admit the pain right here. And our beautiful speaker this morning certainly posed some of the most dramatic evidence of that. And I can only second many of her statistics. I won't repeat them. I'll just mention in a different way what she did bring out very briefly. We have to admit that a newborn in our nation's capital faces worse survival chances than if he or she had been born in Jamaica. Next door in Baltimore, an infant born in Baltimore has less of a chance of surviving its first year than if that child had been born in Guyana or in Panama. I'm sure you're familiar with this. We just need to face it frankly. We need to face this pain, because only if we do this then can we gain the momentum to understand that the suffering that we see here in the United States is not different from that which we can see on our television screens in other countries. But I also suggest that this very real pain is less devastating ultimately than the realization that we have no vision of how to go beyond this pain, no vision to pull us together as a people, no vision of how to solve this betrayal of our country. There is a common sense, I think, of how the current system works. There is no vision of where we're going. The sense of how the system works can be summed up in a story about two hikers on a country, in a mountainside on a beautiful day. These two hikers are walking along the path and they're having a great time until they look up and they see a bear lumbering down the hillside, and immediately one of the hikers takes off his backpack, pulls out his running shoes and starts to put on his running shoes. And his friend looks at him and says, "What are you doing? Are you crazy? You can't outrun that bear." And he looks down at his friend and he said, "Hey, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you." I think this image does capture something of our sense of how the system currently works. As we lose 400 farms a day, as near my home in Fremont, California, when the General Motors plant closed and 13 workers committed suicide in the first 3 months, these farmers and these workers, they're eaten by the bear. This is our sense, I think, of our life and death competition with each other. This is how the system works. Now, what would it take? What would it take if my charge to us this afternoon is that even worse than the pain, even worse than the violations that we feel, is that there is no vision of how to go beyond them? Then where do we begin this work? How do we build this vision? And how did we ever get here to begin with? My sense is that one reason that we have no vision is that we've confused economic and political devices or institutions or mechanisms with the essence of our values, with the essence of the values that our country is supposedly based upon, values like freedom, democracy, and fairness. We've confused human-made devices with our enduring values. And this is part of the unpeeling of the onion, the peeling away. This is my sense of maybe one of the initial layers. That if we can do this work and we can see that this has been our mistake, then a vision of the future can emerge. What do I mean? We've confused mechanisms with principles, with values. Very simply, I'll just mention two. We've confused the market distribution of goods and services and the unlimited control of productive property with the essence of freedom and democracy themselves. When we confuse human-made devices with the essence of our principles, what happens? What happens is that we forget to ask the most basic questions of all. Under what conditions can these very useful devices serve human freedom? So I'll just briefly talk about the market and private property to give you an idea of what I mean. 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to debate Milton Friedman on the Berkeley campus. It was one of the only times in my entire public life that I have been the less controversial speaker on the platform. It was wonderful. It was absolutely wonderful. It was also quite wonderful because he said exactly what I expected him to say. When he got to the microphone, of course, he praised the market because it liberates us, because it responds to human preferences. The market gives people what they want instead of what some government planner says they want. Well, when my turn came and I took the mic, I said, "Dr. Friedman, I have been studying world hunger all of my adult life, and I've noticed one salient feature, that for all living creatures, the first preference is to eat. And 500 million people living in market economies are not eating. Clearly, we need to rethink your formulation, that the market can respond to human preferences and therefore liberate us only under certain conditions. And what are those conditions? Certainly, as income becomes more tightly held, and I would say under the Reagan administration that the shift of wealth from the bottom 90% to the top 1% has been the most dramatic in Western history in any country. I can't prove that, but this is my hunch. If you look at the statistics that the richest 1% have gained 50% in income, that billionaires have doubled in the last 3 years in real dollars. But I'm getting off my point. But the point is that when purchasing power is widely skewed, what happens? I heard Bloomingdale's CEO at Christmas time say that demand for caviar had increased by 40% in 1 year at Christmas time, while we all know that we're seeing in our own communities people living without homes. What happens on a global level? You know that indeed on a global level, while more than 500 million people go hungry, that more than 40% of the grain produced in our world is fed not directly to people but to livestock. This again is because people don't have the wherewithal to make a demand for that grain in the marketplace. That's the consumer side. The producer side is what Mark will be focusing on. What happens when gross inequalities exist among producers and in producers in relation to those who trade their commodities? What happens is that producers can knock themselves out, as a country like Tanzania did a couple of years ago, and doubled its export of its primary export crop, and the earnings were identical. No doubling of exports, and yet the value of that crop had so declined that it had no net increase. And this is what Mark will be talking about. But my point is that if we start with the assumption that as long as we have the market in place, then we have freedom, as Milton Friedman would put it, then we do not ask these more basic, the most critical question of all: under what conditions can it serve our freedom? But then when we begin asking, under what conditions can the market serve our freedom, and we talk about the widest dispersion of purchasing power, what happens? What happens is that we run smack dab into the second absolute that we associate, that we have linked, that we make the embodiment of our values, and that is the unlimited accumulation of private property. Again, we think of it as an absolute, so we do not ask the most basic questions. Now, this view that unrestrained control of income-producing property is the bulwark of our liberty was commented on very tersely, but I think I can certainly improve on it with his short comment. Charles Lindbaum, the economic philosopher at Yale, in his classic book, Politics and Markets, Charles Lindbaum says, income-producing property, like land, is the bulwark of liberty only for those who have it. It's something that we forget when we assume that private property in and of itself, and of course I'm talking about productive property, not hair dryers or lawnmowers, when we assume that the existence of these mechanisms in itself is free. So what happens, we don't ask the fundamental question, under what conditions, and talk about the widest dispersion of access to the security of income-producing property, and without that then the worst fears of our founders, and I will be in a moment tying this back into the founding vision of our country, begins to materialize. It has materialized. The latest Federal Reserve figures show that the top 1% of wealth holders in the United States control as much financial wealth as the bottom 90% of us. 1% as much as the bottom 90%. Now, another layer. Why? Why have we allowed this to happen? My charge to us this afternoon is we have in part allowed this to happen because we're not sure enough of what our values are to begin with. So we wouldn't know quite how to distinguish between a device and our values themselves. It's very easy to confuse a particular institution like the market or property with freedom and democracy if we don't know what we mean by freedom and democracy to begin with. And so my challenge is that we need to begin the dialogue. Our knees can't no longer jerk when Reagan talks about freedom fighters representing us in Central America. We have to think, what does freedom mean? Are they freedom fighters? But let me just go through the three values that are central to everything we're talking about this afternoon. First, democracy, then freedom, then fairness. Democracy, what is it? Is it elections? Is it multiple parties? That's what Americans have been taught to believe. But wait a minute. I remember talking to a nun in Central America a few years ago, and she said, you know, if political parties were the definition of democracy, Guatemala would have to be awarded the Democracy Capital of the World award. There were something like 20 some odd parties, none of them representing the majority of people, anything close to the majority of the people in Guatemala. And what about multiple parties? I remember being in Tanzania in 1978, and I had the honor of meeting the president of that country, Julius Nyerere, at the time he was president. And he had just been talking with some American journalists who were chiding him about his one-party state. And his response, he shared with us, he said, you know, I told those American journalists, he said, I really don't know how you can attack Tanzania. He said, you Americans, he said, you have a one-party state too. But in your typical, extravagant American style, you have two of them. My point is not to denigrate multiple parties, free elections. They are essential instruments of democracy, but as forms, as necessary but not sufficient conditions, as simply as forms, as mechanisms, they can actually disguise the fact that democracy does not exist. But what do I mean then? I've got to define it if I can't define it in institutions. I would suggest that we begin to define democracy in terms of a set of interlocking principles. And the effect of that is quite profound. What happens? What are these principles? First, the principle of accountability. That those people who are making the decisions have to answer to those who have to live with them. Those people who have to live with the consequences, they participate in the decisions, their needs are considered in the decision-making process. It's a fundamental concept of accountability. The second principle of democracy, it seems to me, would have to be the principle of shared power. I'm not naive enough to think, I don't think any of us are, that there can be a society with an equality of power, where everyone has equal power. But my suggestion for a beginning point is that we must define democracy in such a way that we say that in a democracy, on the principle of shared power, it means that no human being is denied all power. In a democracy, no human being is pushed outside community, so they are left powerless. The consequences of this definition are quite interesting when we come down to hunger and to famine. Because since we know that the first need of every living creature is to eat and to feed one's offspring, then wherever there is hunger, in Oakland where I live, in Fort Worth or Dallas, or wherever you come from, as well as in Manila or San Salvador or New Delhi, wherever there is hunger, it means that the promise of democracy has not been fulfilled. If we define democracy in terms of these underlying principles, we can begin to cut through the rhetoric to the reality that our principles have been violated. This is not a separate issue, it is a fundamental issue of democracy. The second principle I want to talk about is freedom. There is one definition of freedom that has been strongly reinforced in the 1980s. It is the Reagan definition of freedom. It can be summed up, he said it so clearly in 1983 when he said, "What I want to see above all is that this country remains a country where someone can always get rich." He said it. The definition of freedom is unlimited accumulation. Notice he said someone can always get rich, not everyone. The definition is of unlimited accumulation. The definition is a material definition of freedom. It is the definition that Robert Bork laid out in his non-confirmation hearings, in which he said, freedom is a mathematical equation. The rights, if my rights increase, it means that your rights are impinged upon. That's the way it is. It is a balancing act. There's only so much to go around. In other words, it's a trade-off. It's a zero-sum concept. What I'm suggesting is that deep in the roots of the religious traditions represented in this meeting, as well as those in most cultures in the world, and certainly in ours, there is a very different understanding of freedom, and that Reagan's definition is new ersatz and a violation of humanity. What do I mean? Deep in our traditions, including our secular traditions, is another understanding of freedom. Not freedom for unlimited acquisition, but freedom for unlimited human development. If we define freedom as unlimited human development, intellectual, physical, artistic, and spiritual, then it is no longer zero sum. It is not finite. My artistic development need not detract from yours. Your intellectual advances need not reduce my ability to develop my own intellectual powers. That's an absurd thought, isn't it? In fact, my development depends on you. I am so limited in my talents. You have those that I do not have. And even where we share talents, I need you who are ahead of me to inspire me. We understand freedom then as interdependent, as mutually expanding horizons. It is neither finite nor divisible. It is a concept that is infinite and indivisible. Once we shift our understanding of freedom then, we begin to understand its interrelatedness, and we begin to see poverty and hunger in our country in a totally different light. And we begin to see the invisible, what is robbed from us of the 1/4 of our children under the age of 6, 1/4 American children growing up in poverty. We are robbed, all of us are robbed, of the gifts that are being thwarted, that are being stunted by their spiritual, intellectual, and physical thwarting. Once you understand freedom that way, the burden on us is not the burden of improving our welfare system. The burden is poverty itself that robs us, all of us, whether we are poor or not. The third value of which I will speak is fairness or justice, as you in the religious community prefer to call it. The secular version of that is fairness. I think that in the popular culture, unfortunately, what is taught, and I've been reading a lot of conservative literature lately, so I think I can speak with a little bit of authority on how this is couched in the popular culture. Those of us working for social change are often pushed into the corner, and we are told that, well, we care a lot about justice. Look at all our justice and peace commissions. We care a lot about justice, but we're willing to sacrifice freedom. We're willing to coerce people, to force them to give up their property or income in order to further justice. And my call among my calls today is for us to, with great confidence, to let go, to resist that charge against us. It's a total misinterpretation. It is not justice versus freedom. This is absolutely false. Once we understand freedom as human development, then justice or fairness is the essential component without which there is no freedom, because the ultimate coercion is the coercion of economic and psychological and physical deprivation. This is the coercion. This is the lack of freedom that comes in a highly unfair society such as ours. So we must let go of this false notion of the trade-off between freedom and justice. Now, one of the great assets of beginning to see our values, the values underlying these institutions, instead of confusing these institutions with our values. Once we understand freedom and democracy in terms of underlying principles, then we are liberated to see that these principles apply equally well in economic as in political life. You see, the right wing has often charged those working for social change that what we want to do is conflate, is bring together economic and political structures like they have in the Soviet model, and all under one state control, and that's totalitarianism. What we're saying is utterly the opposite. What we are saying when we talk in terms of principle is not a conflation of institutions, but the extension of these principles throughout both political and economic life. The principles of democracy, that is accountability and shared power, as I mentioned, apply equally well in political and economic life. For example, the year that I was born, to give you one example, the year that I was born, 1944, Franklin Roosevelt understood this quite well when he called for a new understanding of citizenship, a second Bill of Rights, an economic Bill of Rights to complement our political Bill of Rights. He said, a necessitous people are not a free people. He understood that the concept of freedom and democracy, the principles extended throughout economic life. Put another way, once we begin to understand our values and don't confuse them with particular institutions, we can begin to see that there is an economic underpinning. This is what the point I was trying to make earlier. There's an economic underpinning to the political concept of democracy and freedom. And on this, our founders, many of our founders, were very sharp people. I can quote from John Adams, for example, who said that the balance of power in society accompanies the balance of property and land. The only possible way of preserving the balance of power on the side of equal liberty is to ensure that everyone has access. You see, once you begin to understand once you begin to understand our values in the light that I'm suggesting today, we can then see, again, back to the theme that there are conditions that must be established first. There's an economic basis that has not been laid for us to manifest these values in our lives. And it was Thomas Jefferson who wholeheartedly agreed with John Adams, because in 1785, sitting in France, looking at the misery that was rooted in the poverty of the rural people who were so poor because of the concentration of land ownership, similar to what we are moving toward in our very own country today. Jefferson was walking down a country road, and he met a young woman who was a single mother trying to raise her children with no land of her own. And he wrote back to America, and he said, legislators cannot invent too many devices to subdivide property. It's not a Jefferson quote that you hear too often. But my point here is then that we must begin to see that that once we understand democracy and freedom as a set of values, we begin to see then that there is an economic basis for these that must be put in place. They are not automatically established once we have the market system or private property. Now, essentially, it is essential as we begin to think of freedom, democracy, and fairness. We must, in my own mind, I almost see it visually, these values embedded in a dialogue about rights and responsibilities. And this is key to everything that I'm saying. In other words, again, I'm listening to a lot of people who criticize those of us working for social change. And they often, what do we talk about? We talk about economic rights, we talk about welfare rights, we talk about gay rights, we talk about women's rights, children's rights, animal rights, and often we're heard not to be talking about duties, responsibilities, and we get misunderstood. So as I wrap up this portion on values, let me just say that it is essential that we ground everything that we are talking about in our discussion of the values that guide our work, allowing us to cut through the superficiality of mechanisms and institutions as definitions, that we ground it in a dialogue about rights and responsibilities, that we make absolutely clear that what we are talking about is not taking people off the hook and coddling people and giving them rights without duties, without responsibilities. Precisely the opposite. We are saying that the pain in our society is largely because we have not linked rights and responsibilities. And I think this is what Mark will be talking about too with you, that it is a lack of accountability of the major decision makers in our economy, in our polity, who are not accountable to those who have to live with the decisions. The governance structure of our major corporations, whether we're talking about a Cargill, a General Foods, or a GM, ultimately, the accountability structure of our major corporations increasingly over the last 100 years has been accountable to itself. Now, originally, as the corporation emerged, this somewhat made sense. There was a legitimacy, we thought, because there was a unison between, right, what's good for General Motors is good for the United States. There was a sense that as they prosper, we all prosper. But as the the century has moved forward, that legitimacy, that assumption of accountability that really perhaps was never there since the 19th century, early 19th century, 18th century, we begin to see that that legitimacy that was assumed doesn't exist. That accountability to those who have to live with the consequences does not exist, so that a corporation can close a plant, move out of a town, destroy a community, without having to live with the consequences of the pain that is caused. And Lee Iacocca can essentially give himself in effect, when you think of who's making the decisions here, $18 million. Did you see that a couple of weeks ago? My son was looking at this and saw this. $18 million a year to Lee Iacocca. And we sat down and figured out that Lee Iacocca, in 3 hours, makes the median income. Is that accountability? Is that the linking of rights and responsibilities that we're talking about? We think about the U.S. corporation in this light, and we think about our trade problems, and we want to blame Taiwan or blame some other country. When Robert Reich, in a current article in the Atlantic Monthly, points out that 30% of our trade deficit with Taiwan, 40% of our trade deficit with Japan is accounted for by U.S. corporations producing in those countries and exporting the goods back to the United States. Where is the accountability structure? So we must make absolutely clear, again, we must clarify as we talk about the extension of rights of citizens into the economic arena, as we talk about farmers, as we talk about everyone, the extent to which we as citizens have rights to participate in economic as well as political decision making. It means that we must make clear that we are talking about recoupling, about reconnecting rights and responsibilities. If we talk about workplace ownership or effective unions, what are we talking about? Without such a structure of responsibility in the workplace, of participation, worker ownership, effective unions, a worker can say, look, I just work here. I'm not responsible. We're talking about putting people on the hook, connecting rights and responsibilities. The Land Stewardship Project, which all of you I'm sure have heard of, based in Minnesota, that's exactly the theme then of linking the right to ownership of our irreplaceable farmland with the responsibility to use it carefully, to guard it. And once we begin to look in this new framework, we're liberated to see events abroad differently. We look at land reform in a country like Nicaragua. Instead of seeing, oh, it's a violation of democracy and freedom because there's a land redistribution, we see it differently. And we see what they're trying to achieve is a linking of rights and responsibilities, because they say to all farmers in that country that you have the right to land. You have the right to, in a sense, whatever you can farm. But you have to make it productive. You have to farm it. You can't leave it idle when people are starving in Nicaragua. If you do leave it idle, it will be taken from you. So once we begin to look in a new framework, understand freedom, democracy, fairness embedded in the coupling, in the linking of rights and responsibilities, then we are free to look with fresh eyes. We can see then that the market and private productive property as what they are, as servants of our values, not masters over us, as servants of our values. And then we can see that as moral agents, we set the value parameter. That's what the citizens of Nebraska did, and other states, but I pick out Nebraska because it's particularly dramatic, an amendment to their state constitution in 1982, in which Nebraskans voted their values, not their pocketbooks, when they voted for Initiative 300 that, in effect, not literally, but in effect, keeps the effect of it is to keep non-farm corporations out of agriculture. They could have voted the pocketbook and said, look, I want Prudential to bid for my land, so my land prices will go up. Instead, they voted for an amendment which says my higher value, in which the market must adhere to, is the protection of the family farm community. We see then that also our responsibility as moral agents is not just to set the parameters, but to say that certain things are too sacred to be left to market exchange. And one of those, of course, and Thelma talked about it this morning, is our very health. That to leave health care to the market, particularly in a society with the extremes of income that we do, is a violation then of what we know to be necessary to put the market, to make it as a servant, to say that some things are too sacred. And I could go on and on, of course, personally, the one that's gotten me the most lately is a surrogate motherhood when we're selling babies. But ultimately, we must say that there is that which is sacred and cannot be exchanged in the market, and I think our health care is one. But okay, I want to get on. I'm going to jump over one point and so I can get on to the conclusion here. But maybe we can talk about it in the questions. I'll just tell you what I wanted to talk about as I jump over it. My other point that I wanted to make is that once we begin to think in this new way, we're no longer stymied by the attack that comes down on us that says, hey, it's great to talk this way, but ultimately it comes down to big government, intrusion in our lives by totalitarian interventionist government. And I want to really answer that, but I want to leave the other speaker plenty of time because Mark has a lot to say, and I want to move on to the final part of my talk because it's even more difficult. As I conclude, I have to ask us to realize that I'm not naive, and none of us are naive enough to think that this work is easy. What I'm asking us to do is to give up absolutes that are comfortable, that we have been around for centuries, and my own sense of it is that what happens somehow is when the idea of some interventionist God who can sort of anoint things and say, well, it's all right, when that was given up in the 17th century, and then we latched on to after Newton and then with Darwin and the idea that there are these laws governing the physical and biological world, we came up with this idea that, well, there are laws governing the social world, there are economic laws, we just have to find them and follow them. And now I'm saying that we have to give up that whole approach. That's our very undoing. That in fact, we were always told in every religious tradition not to follow false gods. The weight of my remarks is that that's exactly what we've been doing. And while we've been following these false gods, these absolutes that we have placed above our values instead of at the service of them, what has happened is that the ante has been upped and upped and upped to the point as my generation was the first then to realize that the stakes are ultimate. The stakes are now the very survival of life on this earth. Now, what happens when we realize the challenge that we're asked to do something that has centuries been embedded in us, that there are these rules we can follow, we're asked to do this hard work, from where does our courage come? That's an even more personal question. I know you all have answers to that. We're all struggling every day to find sources of personal courage. I can say that one of the most fortunate blessings, the blessings of my life is that I have been able to be in personal contact with people whose lives were so much more limited than mine, and yet somehow in what I call a revolution of human rights throughout the world that I perceive, and I'm sure many of you perceive, a revolution that is happening in people's consciousness because people are discovering their innate worth. Whether we're talking about the South African compounds that Jim Wallace described this morning, or a particular person I have in mind, Elvia Alvarado, Honduran peasant woman who I met, her voice we published in a book called Don't Be Afraid, Gringo. But Elvia, and I'm sure you each probably have individuals like this in your mind, you see a transformation in which they come to see their innate worth. They come to understand the gospel differently. In Elvia's case, it was very much through initial literacy program. She now is leading men in a very macho culture. She is leading men to stand up for their rights to land in a country that has received incredible amount of U.S. military aid. And so they have the weight not just of the Honduran government against them. All they're asking is to enforce a law that has been on the books for many years. Now, as I talk about this search for the courage to carry through with this process, and I mention Elvia, what comes to mind as I think about this person is that what I see is that she has discovered her innate beauty. And this brings me then to the final layer that we have to begin to unpeel. It is a layer of we have to really examine in our heart of hearts, what do we assume human nature to be? It's that basic. I don't think any of this work is possible unless we take it that far. My fear is that what has happened in our culture, because in large part of the traditional religious traditions in our culture and many other factors, my fear is that that many of us have come to believe that, in fact, the market mechanism, as I've described it, or unlimited accumulation of private property, that rather than any kind of violation, they are the reflection of our true nature. And this we have to sort out. Because if we believe that, I think we're lost. If we believe that, in fact, our nature is atomistic, is separate, we're unable to know and to feel each other. If our nature is self-seeking and it is ultimately materialistic, material acquisition is our definition, then indeed the market mechanism does reflect that, doesn't it? Market exchange reflects the kind of policy that would flow from that understanding of ourselves. So I think it is very, very important that we begin to examine whether or not this is indeed our nature. And I'm suggesting that we go beyond this endless debate about are we genuinely selfish or are we genuinely selfless. I don't think there's any value in that. I think that what I sense emerging in liberation theology, which in some ways Elvie was probably affected by, is an understanding and that our nature is so profoundly social in every sense that it is impossible, utterly impossible, to separate self-love and love for others. They are so intertwined. And in my own work, the most delightful discovery of the articulation of this from the secular tradition. You can find this in many beautiful statements in the religious tradition, but in the secular tradition, nowhere has it been more eloquently put forward than by, guess who? You would never guess, Adam Smith. The same Adam Smith who's on the neckties in the White House. The same Adam Smith who supposedly said we were all selfish, self-seeking, that the market therefore best reflected our nature. Adam Smith wrote a beautiful book that he revised throughout his lifetime. He did not reject this theory. He wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. The Theory of Moral Sentiments begins with this quote, "How selfish soever man may be supposed to be, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the well-being of others and render their well-being necessary to him, though he gain nothing from it except the pleasure of seeing it." That's how the book begins. But it goes on. It's very sophisticated. I'm sure many modern psychologists would be quite impressed. But his theme is that self-love and love for others cannot be separated because our love for ourselves so hinges on whether or not we are loved by others, whether we're approved by others, but whether we believe that love to be deserved. So how can you ever sort that out? In fact, he commented on the Christian precept to love one's neighbor as oneself, and he rewrote it this way. It is the precept of nature to love ourselves only as we love our neighbors, or what comes to the same thing, as our neighbors are capable of loving us. Once we begin to understand this emerging, and I believe it is emerging, and I can see it in many new teachings that are pulling on very old traditions, that we see that the system of the market exchange as the definition, the primary definition of human relations, and the material definition of freedom are a violation, not a reflection of, but a fundamental violation of our nature. I see this then, that our sense of interrelatedness as, yes, we live in a time when the stakes are ultimate, but whether or not we transcend, whether or not we survive indeed, is dependent then on whether or not we become aware of this interdependent nature in our very souls. Whether we come to see that indeed our nature isn't this atomistic, competitive model that comes up to us from Locke and Hobbes, etc., but rather it is interdependent. It is very practically, certainly it's put forth by seers throughout history, but now very practically speaking, maybe we can see it. And this is what Mark is going to be talking about. The interdependence of American farmers with farmers over there. What is the we are all in the same boat. The American worker, how can the American worker hope to survive, to maintain decent wages at all? If people in the third world are unable even to buy food from their own land, they certainly are going to have to work for wages that will continually threaten and depress U.S. wages. What we begin to see then is that indeed our fate is sealed, our common fate is sealed. So we must believe, no matter how big the challenge, that we are on a precipice of a new understanding. We must then believe that change is possible, and in order to believe in change is possible, it becomes even more intensely personal, doesn't it? Because I'm convinced that we don't believe that things can change in rural Minnesota, or in rural Zimbabwe, or in the Philippines, or in Nicaragua, unless we experience change, can know change ourselves. And so then the question becomes, how do we do it? And I think the only way to do that is by risk. Doing that which we thought we could not do. And in the case of what I'm talking about today, certainly there's one very obvious risk, and I'm just going to call it what it is. It means the risk in our society of being called communists. I think we have to say that. Mary Ellen, one of the reasons that I actually got invited to speak today is that Mary Ellen saw a film, which many of you have seen, called The Politics of Food, a beautiful documentary in which it talks about the right to eat. In the newspaper the next day, or the day or so after that showing in which I appeared, there was an attack on me and the Institute, basically claiming that I was a communist because I articulated the right to eat as a basic human right. So actually it turned out to our advantage. We threatened to sue and we got a whole page. My point, though, is that the ultimate challenge, the belief in change, and I'm wrapping up here, you can take a deep breath. My challenge then is that to believe in change, we do not have to apologize for the fact that we have no models to guide us. In fact, we can be proud of the fact that we have given up the idea that there are models. We can be unabashed in saying that what we are working for is what does not exist anywhere. And it is a process without end. We can be absolutely unembarrassed to declare this, because indeed, we are in a fine tradition in which it is understood that it is human creation that is in our nature. Human creativity is part of what we are. And to quote Jefferson again, this is actually on his monument in Washington: laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. We might as well require man to wear still the coat which fitted him as a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. So as we move forward into the unknown, we must understand that we are in a fine tradition. Ours was the first political democracy on a grand scale, and it was considered madness. Of the Declaration of Independence, a British officer wrote, "A more false and atrocious document was never fabricated by the hands of man." And James Madison wrote near his death, "Our newborn nation has proved that what before was believed to be impossible." So as Americans, we should indeed believe that something new is possible under the sun. And what I am really talking about then in all my remarks today, as we claim our basic values as the grounding on which we move forward, as we begin to redefine freedom grounded in economic security, I am calling us to claim our birthright. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frankie, very much. This also has given us a chance to stretch, and now we're going to listen to Mark Ritchie. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I want to thank Frankie for all of us, not just for reminding us of our birthright, but also for peeling away enough layers so that I think when we go home, and those of you who will be here the whole time will have a certain kind of spiritual renewal, a certain kind of rededication. But I think we need that rededication coming through new eyes, coming through new years, coming through new thoughts and new values. And I think That's been not only Frankie's contribution this morning, but for those of you who've known her and her work over the years, her contribution for a long time. And I want to actually pick up on one of the very earliest contributions that I know Frankie made in terms of our thinking about the topic today, about famine and hunger, and push it a little further into, let's say, the logical conclusion of some of the mythology that she mentioned earlier. She was talking about the fact that we have come to think of the market and the market economy as a basic value, as a basic good without questioning. And because of that, we have allowed almost unquestioned the notion that the global market, therefore, is the ultimate good, is an ultimate value, should not be challenged or questioned. To ask questions about trade or trade policy in the United States now, although some people have done it a little bit, is to be called a communist or a reactionary. Kind of depends on even the perspective of the person discussing. But to ask the question about whether countries have the right to export or the impact of imports at a time where this nation is running a $180 billion a year trade deficit sometimes seems like lunacy to people. But it's because we have been unquestioning of the myth, unquestioning of the ideology of the market, that we now find ourselves thrown into a lot of turmoil, because now we have to discuss the question of trade. We haven't really peeled back enough onions on some of the more fundamental questions about the market. But when it comes to agricultural trade, and in the United States plays some significant roles, which I'll go into later, but when it comes to looking at agricultural trade, we have some advantages in peeling back the onion. And one of them, of course, is that we do have some general perceptions of our part of the world with these huge surpluses and other parts of the world where people are hungry. We have some images in our minds, some of them useful, but some of them not. But we also have a very, very clear message. I think Frankie and the Institute were very, very critical in getting it moving through the society, but the church as a global force has enforced throughout the world the idea that just because there are surpluses in one place and starving people in others, that dumping those commodities through food aid programs, or whatever word you want to attach to it, is somehow either a solution or good. I think the church has to take credit for the globalization of the understanding that that equation that Frankie so well described in 1974 has been rejected fairly thoroughly, because people have looked at the specifics. Food First, every page was specific examples of how the reality of thinking that that equation was appropriate broke down when you looked at it in real terms. And I think we've incorporated that into our understanding that food aid and the way that we've described assistance in the old days simply doesn't work, and in fact often will create a much worse situation. But because we haven't peeled away enough layers to look at the rationale and the ideology of the market, when we come to the question of moving food from this country to another country, not as food aid, which maybe would set off a red light and we might look into that, but to move it from this country to another country at a very low price, all of a sudden we're without our tools, we're without our what we used to call our crap detectors. We're without those things which tell us in our brains, hey, something may be wrong here. Lots of things intervene. The newspapers tell us we have trade deficits. The newspapers tell us we have a right to export. The newspaper tell us that these awful countries overseas and their farmers are preventing our goods. Lots of information comes in that begins to confuse us. And I think we have to do the kind of fundamental analysis of the mythology about the market, the logic of the global market of trade, to allow us to begin to understand what kind of policy we need to move towards. And I want to put the underline on policy because there is very little which happens that people don't make a decision and carry it out, bring it into fruition. In the way that Frankie talked about the need for land and decentralization of power is critical for democracy. Well, when you see land being absorbed or taken from people and put into larger blocks, it's probably because somebody is consciously trying to limit, constrict, or in some way control power. It doesn't just happen. We're not just happening to lose black farms in the South. Blacks who own land have power, and if that land is taken away from them, they lose power. Native Americans who hold land have power. When you take that land away from them, you take away their power. So in the sense that we as conscious people know about the things we need to do to make the world better, when you see something going on that looks like it's not right, start looking around for the people who are benefiting from that change and try to understand their conscious thinking, the policies which they are implementing to make that change come about. One of the things about not examining the mythology of the market and therefore the mythology of the global market is that it keeps us kind of confused, or it allows us to be more easily confused. For example, trade is a wonderful thing to examine a little more in depth. It's like Frankie describing looking at food and hunger as a way to get a crack, some light into this broader system she was trying to understand. Trade is interesting in that way as well. One of them is that we talk about trade in the newspapers between nations. The United States and Japan, and the prime ministers got together and they discussed trade and the trade imbalance or whatever. And out in the farm country, we talk about, you know, half of Minnesota's farm production, and the farmers are dependent on exports, and farm exports. We go through all this discussing and logic. But the fact of the matter is, at least in the basis of our country, our nation is not exporting. Farmers are not exporting. Corporations export and import. So when we talk about exports, when we talk about trade negotiations, when we talk about trade imbalances and trade balances, these are not things that are between nations or that farmers are doing. They are things that are between corporations. If heads of state get together to discuss trade, they're discussing the rules and conditions by which the corporations which operate within their boundaries will function. If the United States doesn't like something that's going on in Japan about trade, what it really means is that corporations in the United States have told the government that they want their government to defend their interest in relationship to Japan in connection with something going on with corporations in Japan. So we get confused about this in the countryside. Farmers start to think that trade negotiations are somehow about their well-being, or that if we could just boost these exports somehow it would be better for them, or if we could restrict imports or whatever. It's because we haven't looked carefully at the ideology, we then are susceptible to being confused. Corporations come out the countryside and talk about how we have to expand our exports, and they never once say to the farmers, and oh, by the way, you just produce it and sell it to us cheap because we actually take care of the exports. So it's important to keep that in mind. In knowing that corporations are the ones who are engaged in trade, sometimes those corporations might be state-owned enterprises, for example, in some centrally planned economy or other countries, but in our country it's corporations. Knowing that's who creates and handles and manages and controls trade leads us to a couple other things we have to keep in mind. One of them is that it's very likely that under almost any scenario in terms of trade, that the producers, the farmers or the workers in the factories on both sides of the equation are going to lose. You know, we have trade negotiations with Canada that have come out with a proposal. President Reagan and Prime Minister Mulroney have a U.S.-Canadian trade agreement. Well, it's very interesting to read its provisions, because what you discover very quickly is that the family farmers on both sides of the border lost heavily in that agreement. The corporations who handle agricultural trade on both sides of the border, in fact, gained enormous leverage over each other, because it allowed corporations in the U.S. to go to Canada and bring in goods without restrictions, so that they can tell the farmers in the United States, if you don't sell us hogs at this price, we will simply go to Canada where the dollar and the currency differential is this and this, and we can get it for this price. So once you realize that corporations are the ones doing trade, you can then begin thinking about who is winning and losing, because it's not total win-lose situation where farmers on our side get an advantage at the expense of someone on the other side. It's often that people are losing on both sides of the equation, especially farmers and workers. There also gives us some other myths or some other misconceptions we need to look at. One of them is that this idea that somehow more and more exports are going to be good for U.S. farmers. There's a couple things to that that have to be explained, I think, a little more in depth. One of them is you can't just use the word exports and get away with it anymore. You have to really define, especially in agricultural products, are you talking about how many bushels are being shipped overseas, or are you talking about the dollars that are received for that? Frankie talked about Tanzania doubling their exports of their primary commodities and receiving the same money. That's because the U.S. government made a decision to cut the world price in half so that when you sold twice as much, you still got the same amount of money. Well, when the United States government cut the price in half, it was the same impact on the U.S. farmers. We can't always look at the word exports and know what's being meant, but we have to start asking questions about what in fact is going to be good, better for our rural economies. More and more exports clearly are not going to be good for our rural communities under any conditions. The second thing is this notion that imports of cheap commodities from the United States and other surplus producing countries is good for third world countries. Now, luckily, we've got a lot of years of looking at the negative impacts of food aid, so lots of people quickly understand that the only difference between food aid and cheap grain is that in cheap grain you have to pay for it. At least with food aid, you're not necessarily paying for your own destruction. You might be getting it for free. But it's the same impact when we're selling cheap commodities at below the cost of production. Farmers in those third world countries trying to build their own food self-reliance are going to face an unfair competitive situation. When you can buy rice from the United States for $4 a hundredweight, although it costs us $13 to grow it here, if you're in the Cameroons and it costs your local farmers $8 a hundredweight to produce it, so that in the market there's rice from the U.S. with $4, made in the USA, stenciled on the bag, and rice from the Cameroons at $8. It's not, you don't have to be very brilliant or have to go to the Cameroons to figure out what the situation's going to be. The last myth that we often get caught up in, especially now that there's so much discussion on the third world debt, is that somehow opening the U.S. borders to lots of imports from the third world countries is a way to help solve the debt problem of those third world countries. Well, on the one hand, it doesn't at all address the question of whether exports from those countries are controlled by the people themselves who get any benefit. It doesn't address the question of whether those exports are at a profit. But especially in questions of agriculture, almost all instances that have been looked at very clearly shows that the taking of food, I don't mean necessarily specialty crops or whatever, but the taking of land in third world countries which should grow food in order to grow cash crops to be shipped back to the United States will end up being a deficit in terms of the food situation of that country. We need to look at the terms of trade. We need to look at writing off third world debt, which is appropriate. We do need to address directly the crisis of the third world debt. But the notion that the United States should suddenly import a lot of food products, cattle and dairy and a whole lot of other things from the third world simply doesn't hold up when we try to look clearly at what are those values, what are the things that we're trying to achieve. Corporations have convinced us that they have the right to export, but they've done it by convincing us that our nation must have exports or our economy will not function, that our workers will not have jobs, that our farmers cannot hold on to their farms. And I think when we look a little more closely at the development of agriculture and the export component of it in the United States, we'll begin to see that in fact those conclusions which they ask us to draw from their propaganda aren't necessarily true. I want to go back just a little bit and look at the role of agriculture and exports in the U.S. economy, briefly a little bit in history, because I think it's important understanding now, but I want to look at today's situation well, because we're into a transition now, looking at new governments, new policies, and I think the church needs to be well informed if we're going to do something about it. But from the very earliest days of European colonization, agricultural exports and world agriculture situation has been this very important and sort of double-edged sword, at least for the United States. In Jamestown, about 5 years after the founding of the Jamestown colony, the lucrative tobacco market in Europe had become so attractive to the local settlers that they had shifted all their land production, which was growing food for their colony, into tobacco. And it got to the stage of survival that the governor at that moment of Jamestown had to issue a decree that people had to limit the amount of land that they put into tobacco and had to increase the amount of land they used in food crops to ensure the survival of the colony. Well, you can imagine the power of the attractiveness of an export market for tobacco that would take a small colony like that and take it up to the brink of disaster. And again, the governor at that time had to take direct political action, had to dictate. Wasn't the market mechanism. The market told folks, grow tobacco, ship it to Europe. But the government and the collective wisdom had to say back to them, no, that can't be what determines the way we go. We must reorient our priorities. We must change what we're doing to ensure the survival of our colony. So we were very early in our nation's history before the demands, the possibilities of export markets was real crucial in somehow molding how agriculture developed, sometimes very much to the detriment of our country. But also because we were such a large nation with fertile soils and good rain and a lot of good conditions, we've always been a very large producer of agricultural commodities. And at many instances in our life, our brief life as a nation, we've opened up new land, we've had certain perfect weather conditions, many different reasons we've suddenly found ourselves with a huge surplus of production, a huge mountains of commodities. And this has happened numerous times throughout our history. And in the late 1870s and the early 1880s was one of the more dramatic of those periods in our history. And the thing that we chose to do with our mountains of wheat, which we had at that time, was more or less what we've decided to do with them today. The corporations who were exporting and trading with Europe were able to buy those mountains of surpluses very cheaply from farmers. And farmers had severe economic crisis during that period of time. And they could take that cheap wheat and take it over to Europe and sell it into the local markets in Northern Europe and Southern Europe and all over at prices far below the local cost of production in Europe. I mean, we had essentially the same cost of production, but because it was bought so cheaply, they were able to sell it at a very low price. The impact in Europe at that time is the same impact as we see today. Farmers who were trying to grow their own crops and sell them on local markets simply were not able to do it because of the competition, and they lost out on their only source of income to buy the other things that they needed. More dramatically, the large feudal landowners who employed literally thousands of landless peasants, or who had peasants on the land for many, many generations, found that there was no market for the wheat that they were producing, that the peasants were producing on their land. And those peasants were just thrown off of the farms, thrown off the manors, and there was mass starvation. In fact, throughout the kind of history of Northern European agricultural history and agricultural policy history, you see waves of time. You see times where waves of peasants are thrown off their lands because of dumping of agricultural commodities from the United States into those regions. And you see a reaction by the governments where the governments ultimately step into the situation, create border protection or import barriers or import quotas to prevent the United States from being able to dump commodities again and give their farmers a chance to survive and stay on the land. But again, it's for at least 100 years or longer, we have seen this very, very powerful impact that our productive capacity can have on other regions of the world. We're more familiar with it today in terms of the third world, but nonetheless, we've had this same dynamic for a long time. When we look at current federal agricultural policy, which is what I want to shift to because I think we're going to start running out of time, and I do want to make sure we have some discussion. Federal agricultural policy is embodied primarily in one major piece of legislation, currently called the 1985 Farm Bill. It'll come up for review again in 1990. It's in that piece of legislation, which comes up every 4 or 5 years, that our policies that determine how we act in the international market are primarily determined. Current federal agricultural policy, although it's been through a number of changes, is essentially similar to the policies we've had since the early 1970s. Since the 1970s, at a federal level, our agricultural policy has embodied sort of two fundamental principles. The first was that prices paid by the corporations buying commodities were set by the federal government at levels considerably below the cost of production. Currently on rice, which cost us between $11 and $13, the federal government sets the price between $4 and $7, depending on the day of the week. Corn, which cost an efficient Iowa corn farmer $3 to produce, the price is set at about $1.70, on and on and on. Currently, we set by Congress the price paid to farmers at roughly half the cost of production. The second element of our policy is that we use taxpayers' money to then cover part of the loss that the farmers face from having to sell their commodities to Cargill and whoever at half the cost of production. In the early 1970s, although this policy was sort of ludicrous from many points of view and certainly could be a disaster for taxpayers, the policy worked from the point of view that farmers received enough in taxpayers' money so that what they lost selling their commodities they were able to make up and break even. So the merchant in town didn't really think about it because the farmers still had money in their pockets, the churches were still able to be supported, things were able to function more or less as they had before, but the money came from a different source. By the late 1970s, we began seeing budget deficits in a serious way. We began seeing cutbacks in government. We began seeing changing in the thinking at the national level. Now, there wasn't a willingness to change the policy to raise the price so that the corporations had to pay the full cost of production. In fact, that was resisted with the utmost political power because those corporations had found that by taking commodities at half the cost of production, they could go overseas and expand our exports almost exponentially. Our exports went up fourfold and then fivefold in the 1970s to a high of about $44 billion in 1981. So the corporations fought, when the debate came down in Congress, the idea that they should start paying the full cost of production and give the taxpayers a break. So the only solution that was left in that political mix was to begin cutting back what was being paid by the government to cover that loss. And it was very, very quickly after that time that farmers no longer received enough to cover the cost of production. They were receiving a price below the cost of production in the market from Cargill and the other corporations. They were receiving a government payment, but the combination of the two was below their cost of production. For a couple years, in fact, people were able to survive this way because they were able to borrow more against their land. The 1970s were a time of incredible inflation. You could go into your banker, say, look, I lost money on my corn this year and my government payments weren't enough for me to be able to pay my loan back to you. And the banker would say, look, I know you lost this money and the payments aren't enough, but you know your land went up another 15%. We'll just loan you enough money and roll over your note, and by the time you retire, you'll be a millionaire. So again, the policy was changed, but a lot of folks didn't notice because farmers still had some money in their pocket from what they sold to Cargill. They had government payments, and they could borrow a little more money from the bank. But of course, in 1980 and 81, with the coming of the new administration and the 1981 Farm Bill, this system began to unravel because land no longer was going up. Banks could no longer afford to continue making the lending. And we've seen the farm crisis of 1980 came as a result of that overall policy. In 1985, in the midst of this crisis, we again debated the federal farm policy. There was very little debate in sense about sort of what was happening to farms in rural community. The struggle, the central issue in 1985 was a debate over how are we going to handle federal policy in relationship to farm exports. And I think the reason for that is that at a senior level, the policymakers, especially at USDA, are all former executives from grain corporations. And keep in mind, those corporations are the ones who are involved in exports. They're looking for volume. They're looking to buy as cheaply as possible and to be able to sell as freely as possible without rules and regulations globally. And so their advocacy in terms of lobbying the 85 Farm Bill was to increase the volume of exports, not necessarily the value, and not necessarily a profitable exports, but to maximize the volume. Farmers, in conjunction with trade unions and civil rights organizations and lots of other people, argued differently. They argued that corporations should have to pay the full cost of production, and that it was not right for them to buy commodities at half the cost of production and to sell them overseas at such low prices. Not only was it ruining our farmers right here in the United States, but it's obviously ruining farmers overseas in other countries as well. The 1985 Farm Bill was fought out on the floor of the House and the Senate. And in the end, President Reagan won and was able to achieve the kind of farm bill that we're living under now, which is designed exclusively to maximize the volume of our exports. It's done at the expense of our own farmers, but it's aimed at taking away markets from farmers in other countries around the world. I think we can look at a couple quick examples to see, in fact, what's embodied in that policy specifically, because it'll give us some idea of the changes that we need to make when we start to try to take this policy back. And I just want to take corn as a quick example, because it's really, to me, one of the most outrageous. This is a country that produces between 7 and 8 billion bushels of corn. And I'm going to use some numbers, and don't try to remember them, but they're to give you some idea of what we're doing here. We produce 7 or 8 billion bushels of corn, and we export about 1 billion bushels of corn. So the federal government decided that we need to set the price of corn at roughly half the cost of production. That will then allow our corporations to go overseas and maximize the markets that they can take over. And one of the things that that means is that for all those bushels of corn produced, we as taxpayers have to come up with at least some money for the farmers, or they go flat broke in a minute. So we, in fact, allow corn to be sold to Cargill for about $1.50, and the taxpayers put up between $1 and $1.20, so the farmers get around $2.70 for their corn. It costs between $3 and $3.25 to grow corn, so folks are continuing to go downhill in their economic situation. There are a lot of little tricks put into the farm bill, pick and roll and lots of stuff. So folks have hung on, and it's election year, and so in election years, people hang on and there's lots of money. But what that meant is that we as taxpayers paid out over $1 per bushel for 7 billion bushels of corn, over $7 billion, in order to subsidize so that those corporations could ship 1 billion bushels of corn, which was worth about $1.50 a bushel, so it's worth about $1.5 billion. We as taxpayers shelled out, actually the truth of the matter is it turned out to be $13 billion, but to keep it simple, we shelled out over $7 billion to subsidize corporations so they could ship between $1 and $2 billion worth of corn. I mean, we kicked the Pentagon's behind for this kind of numbers and monkey business, but we let the grain companies just do this almost without comment. So that's bad enough. We have a budget deficit. In fact, between corn and wheat, those subsidies equaled what we were forced to make as cuts under Graham-Rudman in the first year, between $12 and $13 billion. All those babies that were born at very low weights because they lacked prenatal care, all the babies who died from infant mortality because their mothers were not able to get the kind of care because that care was cut under Graham-Rudman. That's what we got for spending $13 billion to subsidize those exports overseas. All the senior citizens without help, all the school milk programs, all those things that we lost because of Graham-Rudman cuts were so that we could help finance these kind of exports by these corporations. So that's kind of how it affects us here at home. But it's overseas where you begin to see the deadliness of the policy. Zimbabwe is a good example. The World Bank and others have been active, encouraging them to expand their corn production because it could be sold on the world markets, and with that money they could turn around and pay some of their debts to our banks and to others as well. When the United States cut the price of corn that dramatically, it essentially allowed us to continue to dominate the world market. We've previously controlled between 70 and 80% of the world market. So when we lowered our price that far, anyone else who wanted to sell corn had to lower their price that far as well. And essentially the United States took over the whole market. Zimbabwe has these mountains of corn stored in the worst possible conditions, rotting, unable to sell it. And of course, that which they can sell, what they receive for it is nearly half, only half of what they were receiving before, which makes the terms of trade and their debt situation even worse. But the other impact of cutting prices of corn that far is that it all of a sudden makes corn a cheaper raw material for the people who use corn for lots of different things. For example, corn is the primary ingredient in making corn sweeteners. And we make a syrup out of corn that's a sweetener. And when you bring corn down to $1.50 instead of the $3 or more where it should be, you can make corn sweetener cheaper than you can produce sugar. And the minute corn sweetener could be made cheaper than sugar, our soda pop industry switched 100% to high fructose corn sweetener, and we cut off our imports of sugar from the Philippines, Caribbean, from around the world. Now, of course, the Reagan administration looks at this sugar price here and high fructose corn sugar price here and says, well, that's a big difference. That's really bad for everybody. We should lower the price of sugar. Instead of somebody saying, yeah, the high fructose corn syrup is so cheap because you've lowered the price of corn. But what happens is that because we've made corn cheap and made corn sugar and corn syrup so cheap, we've essentially stopped importing sugar. No matter what you think about sugar or monoculture or whatever, millions, hundreds of millions of people on the face of this earth earn what they need to survive, even at the minimal level they may survive, from sugar and the production of sugar. And by cutting off those imports like that, we create a crisis in many parts of the world. There's 250,000 sugar cutters starving today on the island of Negros in the Philippines, in addition to bringing a big boost to the communist insurgency on that island as well because of these kind of policies. Now next year, under the 85 Farm Bill, the price of corn is scheduled to go down even further. If it goes down to $1, then corn syrup can be crystallized in an economically feasible way so that we can then turn around and begin shipping crystallized little packets of corn syrup that looks like sugar to the world market. And if the United States can get into a position to take over the world market of sugar, that means all of those hundreds of millions of people who live now by the production of sugar are simply out of luck. There are other people who use corn as a raw material as well. For example, in the United States, 3 corporations now raise over half the cows and control by contracts 90% chicken that we eat. Well, if you're a family farmer in Iowa or Minnesota and you're trying to grow corn and feed cow and have cows on the hillsides, which is where they should be for the ecology and all that stuff, it costs you $3 to grow the corn that you want to feed your cows. But if you're Cargill with 100,000 cows in a big feedlot, you're able to go and buy the corn at $1.50. Well, who's going to be more cost competitive? Who's going to be able to sell at a lower price and wipe out the family farm? The same is true in other countries as well. As long as we're willing to provide such cheap feed grains, then this expansion of the corporate feedlot type cattle raising system is going to go globally. So there are lots of ways in which the setting of that price of corn at such a low level can impact people around the world. Rice is another specific example, and I'll just try to do it quickly so you can see it. Our policy on rice was to let the world price collapse, which is what we did. We used to support the price of rice at about $9. It fell to $3.50 immediately after the implementation of this law. The first big impact that we could see in here came from the other big exporter of rice, Thailand, which is about the same as the United States in terms of total exports, but of course it's the key component in their export earnings, which they need to pay their bills, their debts, and to import fuel, medicine, other things that they need. We cut the price of rice almost by 2/3, at least by half, and it cut the import earnings of Thailand in half, just like that. In fact, there was a riot outside of the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok against the U.S. 1985 Farm Bill. I mean, we didn't have riots here. We had people shooting themselves and a lot of other things. But it's interesting that around the world, people understand the impact of our policies on them. Well, the purpose of this policy was to put Thailand and other rice producers out of business so that we sold it cheap, that would put other producers out of business, and we could take over those markets. Well, Thailand, and that's an interesting idea, but it's got nothing to do with reality. They still have to make their bank payments at the end of the month. If they're getting paid half of what they were being paid, they then are forced to try to double their production and double their sales to maintain the same cash income. In fact, the United States and Thailand began getting into this bidding war around the world, each willing to sell it at a lower and lower and lower price. And for Thailand, what was at stake was the need for export earnings. It didn't matter how far we pushed down the price, because Thailand still needed dollars that could only be earned by shipping something overseas. Now, they could earn that by shipping heroin, they could earn it by shipping something. They like to earn it by shipping rice. But when we are out there trying to be price competitive with them, it makes it very difficult. By the time the season was most of the way done, the United States and Thailand were both willing to sell rice into West Africa at between $80 and $100 a ton below the local cost of production. And the Cameroons, which had spent many years trying to build its own rice self-sufficiency and to build its own reliance, we essentially wiped out the rice farmers in a very, very short period of time, creating crisis. I mean, it wasn't just that impact. For example, aid programs in Western Africa, which were serving parts of the Sahel and others, had policies that they had to buy from the cheapest source. Now, there's one part of that that makes sense, right? You're over there, you're with Catholic Relief Services, you have a budget of $1 million. You want to get the most rice you can for that $1 million to feed as many people. So if you spend that $1 million on buying imported U.S. or Thai rice, instead of buying rice from Cameroon's farmers, you've accomplished one short-term gain, but you have set the nation back very dramatically. And all the programs, especially those that the U.S. government had control over, like the World Food Program and other, were under those kinds of orders. And so you can see a compounding of the problem. So we see these kind of impacts globally, and folks in the rest of the world also understand their impacts, and opposition to them arising. Churches and farmers around the world have been speaking up about these policies, and the thing that's being pointed to at the central element of this crisis is a question of export dumping. It's a question of fairness in trade. In manufactured goods, it's essentially illegal to sell commodities overseas at below your cost of production. If Japan tries to sell semiconductors in the United States at below the cost of production, the industry will be in Washington, they'll have investigations, they'll assign a tariff, and we'll essentially stop that from happening. It simply is not allowed. But selling farm goods overseas at below the cost of production is almost the rule. It's not the exception, it's the rule. But now people are beginning to say, hey, we need the same rules of fairness in agricultural trade. If the United States could not sell commodities overseas at below the cost of production, many other positive benefits would come to many other people and farmers and people around the world. Because there's this opposition rising, and I'm going to try to move through some history here quickly, all around the world, people are beginning to speak up about the policies. All of a sudden, words and names and institutions that had no meaning before are suddenly on the lips of farmers around the world. The GATT negotiations, what's that? The UNCTAD, the trade negotiation, U.S.-Canadian agreement. Suddenly farmers who thought they could worry about producing, maybe thought they had to worry about what was going on in Washington, now realize that they have to worry about what's going on in Geneva. A farmer in the south of France who used to worry about what was going on in Paris, maybe, and maybe thought about what was going on in Brussels, where their policies and prices are set, now has to worry about what's going on in Geneva and what's going on in Washington, having to suddenly become skilled in new words and new languages and in new issues and new topics if they're ever going to be able to sort of get back to the kind of values and kind of work that they thought they were getting into when they began producing. And the rising opposition has actually begun to take hold in a much more organized way around the world. And in fact, we're beginning to see certain shifts of policy, but also we're beginning to see shifts in policies here as well. Most of the major farm organizations have now come out against this kind of policy of dumping. For example, the major candidates in the Democratic Party for president have all come out solidly against it and said if they're elected, there are going to be changes. And while I was in Europe last year, I spent 6 months in Europe working on U.S.-EC trade relations and an impact on the Third World. About February, March, I felt this sudden shift to the Reagan administration. All of a sudden, I felt a sudden emphasis on the international arena on trade negotiations. And what I discovered in talking and working with people over time was that the Reagan administration had come to the conclusion that the policies in this country were going to change, that the ability of the grain companies to simply dictate the rules in which farmers would live was going to be coming to an end, that attempts in Congress to make a change were getting closer and closer in public opinion, and probably a change in the White House would signal the end of grain company control over U.S. policy. And like they figured out that if they got Star Wars up, a next president probably couldn't do much about it, they figured out if they could change the rules of international trade, that a new government would be preempted, would be prevented from making the kind of changes here that would essentially bring us out of this situation of export dumping back into a more moderate, a more fair, a more even situation. And the United States used the opportunity presented by the global trade negotiations under GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It's the major trade agreement among the industrialized countries. We went to GATT with our proposal for agricultural trade. End all farm programs globally, end all import barriers that we now have, and a lowering of world prices to what they called market clearing levels. Again, it's going back to that mythology, the ideology about the market. This kind of program was called decoupling, or there's lots of words that we use, but think about the implications. They want to change the rules of international trade so that in the United States, if a new government came in and said, hey, we don't want this system of paying farmers half the price and government programs and then a loss. We want to raise the price to a fair price for farmers. They would be prevented from doing that because we had signed an international agreement saying we wouldn't do that. If Zimbabwe wanted to put up an import barrier, or the Cameroons wanted to say, at our borders, you can't ship rice in at below the cost of production because it's ruining our farmers, they would be prohibited from doing that if we had this new trade agreement. There are lots of ways they've thought this through as in terms of an international strategy, and they were able to get some support. Some of the smaller exporters, Canada, Australia, others have supported this general policy. But lots of other farmers and lots of other people of goodwill in other parts of the world and farmers here have spoken out against it. In fact, spoken out enough that last week the European community, which 1 year ago had basically said, yeah, we'll go along with this policy the United States was proposing, last week in the OECD, which is sort of the think tank for our industrial governments, the European community reversed their stand and said, no, we're not going to go along with this policy. In fact, Europe has made a counter-proposal to GATT, essentially the opposite, calling for an end to export dumping, calling for higher world prices, calling for market share agreements. And the new Prime Minister of France, who was elected in this latest election with Mitterrand, in his book about the policies that he would be promoting, he said in GATT we will look for higher world prices, market shares, and supply management, not the U.S. proposal. So we do see a shift taking place. We see a change of government coming in Canada, and the two opposition parties have both said Mulroney, as Prime Minister, has gone along with Reagan and the U.S. position. We reject that. We will call for a change of policy for supply management, higher prices. And we see the possibility of change going on in the United States as well, potential of a new government. At least the people running on the Democratic side have all rejected the policy of export dumping, are talking about higher world prices, supply management, international cooperation, not trade wars. So we're beginning to see a change. We're beginning to see things move. But things don't move in and of themselves. They move because people get organized to make them move. And in the game of trade, what makes it different than some other issues we work on is that the people involved in trade whose interests are at stake are the multinational corporations by definition. And the only multinational force that we have today is the church. Now, we proved a lot with the Nestle's boycott. Looks like we may have to reopen it to go back and remind them, but the church proved as a global multinational force that we could begin changing the policies of corporations which create hunger. Well, this is another level of policies of corporations which is creating hunger, and it's going to take the same multinational forces, the churches, plus lots of other people added together to make this kind of change. It's again going back to that question of our values. It's going back to the question of what are the things we want in the world. It's not asking, well, can we change trade and could the U.S. and change our balance of trade and all those kind of questions that we read about in the newspapers. It's asking the question, do countries have the right to food security? Do we want families on the land in the United States, or do we want them consolidated? Because those people who benefit by taking away our power, what they're keeping they read Jefferson more than we do. They realize that his advice was to come up with as many ways as possible to subdivide property. Well, those corporations don't want that property subdivided and are working very hard so that those people of government don't go about the business of subdividing property. At the same time, they know the mechanisms of transferring wealth from all of us to themselves, so they're real active in the government, and they're not going to give it up easily. This is going to be a war. This is going to be an incredible battle because there's so much at stake. But at the same time, we have our values, which cannot be separated from us. We can be alienated from them, we can be confused, we can forget them, but there are things real basic in people about how we are. And it was real important to me the way Frankie talked about Adam Smith taking our notion of how we want to treat others as we treat ourselves, and thinking about, in fact, what we want to look at is our neighbor's ability fundamentally to treat us. That's the fundamental question in value. That's the fundamental issue. We can get confused. We can think of policies in Washington and Geneva and feel like it's over our head and it's too complicated. They get on television at 5 o'clock and go into this stuff about the trade and the export, and my God, you just think, you know, we could never get this nuclear physicist. But like those experts that Frankie met in Rome who didn't have a notion about what was going on or what to do about it, which is a lot more important. Keep in mind, those people on the TV and those people in Washington talking about trade and these other issues are the exact emperors with no clothes. But more importantly, they are taking us into areas, into brinks. You know, Frankie talked about her generation, my generation, our generation being that which has a more fundamental question of overall survival. This is not a minor or a insignificant point. We get involved in wars in this country primarily because hunger is created, and in a third world country a social conflict arises, a social revolution begins, and the United States gets involved. That's the way we get involved in armed conflict. But think about Argentina and Britain, both in serious economic problems, chose a war in the Malvinas to take their citizens' minds. We invaded Grenada to take our minds off of what happened in Lebanon. If we can't come to some clarity and sense about these values and begin applying them through the political process, through the policy process, because people make policy and policy is what makes that future. If we can't make that future economically stable, environmentally safe, sharing of wealth, and therefore sharing of power, we will move into a very serious economic and social and political crisis. And in an era when young people were raised thinking that we had a depression and World War II solved that depression, in an era where we're told that defense spending creates jobs, in an era like that, we're not in a position to suffer through that kind of economic chaos because we haven't re-educated ourselves and set those values. The church has to set its sight on some goals, like the Nestle boycott was a goal, getting an end to export dumping. Those are goals that are immediate and out here. But it has to set its sight on the reestablishment of values, as Frankie talked about. It's that reestablishment of value that will make this world safe and sustainable. It won't be the specific things we do within it. It will be the change in values that will determine whether we leave our children and their children a better world, or, and sometimes I hate to say this, whether we leave them any world at all. Thank you very much.
I'm sure you feel with me that these have been two very wonderful presentations with a lot of meat and grist for us to deal with. I want to know if there are any of you who have direct questions to one of the speakers or to both of them. Both microphones that are in the center aisle are live and ready to carry any of those questions. Larry, did I see your hand? Come ahead. And you're directing it to whom? Frankie?
Larry Lewis with the NCC Agricultural Missions. First, a little comment. The comment is that about a year ago I saw a graphic that said that Europe was giving about $18 billion worth of aid in that period. I think it was about a year, to Africa, and out of Africa flowed $35 billion worth of anything. I make this comment because there is a tendency among people who receive aid, be it food stamps or even government-to-government aid packages in other countries, to feel guilty at switching from cash crops to food crops. They actually feel as if they're hurting themselves if they make the switch. Yet everything shows that they are losing more by producing cash crops, or by not getting into some productive food-producing activity. That's the comment. The question, Francis, you suggested that there was some unbalanced equation about who is producing and with what methods, and over on the other side there are people just consuming. So you have to suppress the one and uplift the other. I'm sure in this country and among certain audiences, the question that would be addressed to you is, if you really cut the society into pieces, who would be the ones who are having the most babies and who would be the ones who are producing? It also has a lot of racist overtones. Maybe you might like to deal with that one. And then the other question I had, Mark, dealt with the business of debt. There is the tendency to think that debt does not necessarily have to be, and there are remedies such as buying up debt equity that could reduce that. You have to remember here that as long as a lot of the big corporations, vis-a-vis the banks, have debt on their books, they could at least treat it like an asset and then make profit off of the interest. So when you deal with that, you also have to take that. And that has something to do with the food banks and that sort of thing as well.
All right, who wants to go first with their question? Okay.
Yours was really more of asking for me to go further, right? You weren't challenging what I was saying, but saying there's another dimension to it. Yeah, just want to make sure I heard you correctly. And one of the things I just learned, an economist wrote to me recently from Louisiana, who pointed out that the very word proletarian, the roots of the word means those who have many babies, basically the people who populate, in order to make the babies, to make the workers in a society, and that's where did you know that, Mark? I thought that was interesting. But I think, in fact, what I was doing on the plane coming here, what I'm going to be doing on the plane home is finishing a monograph on the world population question. So what I'm trying to do with this paper is link very much the question of the population explosion with an understanding of how it relates to the way that power is held and shared in society, and that that we cannot understand why some people are having many babies and others having fewer babies unless we understand how power is shared from the family, the relationship between male and female, and on up to the level of international trade. And so it is those who are at the bottom, those who have the least power, those who have been made powerless, that having many children in those circumstances is a defense. It is a source of power in a society where they have been made powerless. And of course, in so many societies, that power structure can be put right on top of the color structure, in a sense, and not only in ours, but of course in many others. So there is a very definite link between racism as a part of what disempowers people, and why it is that some people have a lot of children and others have few. And I think it's only in that framework can we really take the population problem seriously. And I think we're going to call this it's part of our development report series, and we're going to call it Taking Population Seriously, because what happens, I think, those of us working on world hunger, I'm sure, Mary Ellen, you faced this over the years, that we're often misunderstood to be saying that we don't take population seriously as a problem, and that we're, by arguing, by proving as we do, and I think all of us have gotten very good at showing that hunger is not caused by rapid population growth, by population density. We can be easily misunderstood to be saying that population isn't a problem. So my challenge in this development report will be precisely that if we're serious about the population problem, we have to get serious about everything from racism to every aspect of the distribution of power in society, to allow people to choose smaller families. And of course, centrally, this is related to the disempowerment of women, that the demographers have found that the single most consistent variable with high birth rates is the level of education of women. The single most important variable. And of course, that's, in social science terms, that's a proxy, that's a stand-in, that the education of women reflects what kind of societies allow women to get educated. Those are societies in which women have more opportunities, in which there is a more fair power structure from the family on up. But I think your question really brings us right into the heart of the matter, and that we must make sure that we're not misunderstood to be saying that population isn't a problem. Exactly the opposite. We want to get serious about solutions.
Also, if I might add, if one compared the population densities and the land availability in many countries in the north with those in the south, even given all the other stories about the soil's fertility or relative soil fertility, one would find that there's a basic inequality that usually spells what the people in the south are producing food. Rather than producing food, they are producing cash crops, which to satisfy a certain market.
Right.
Do you want to respond to the debt question that he had?
I feel like your statement on the debt is absolutely right. We deal with it a lot in the farm community because farm debt, because of the losses in the 70s, reached $224 billion, which is twice the foreign debt of Brazil, spread over 1 million people. It can't be paid, just like the debt in Brazil can't be paid. And of course, banks have written it down to $175 billion in the United States. We've written off almost $50 billion worth of debt. So we can clearly do it in the third world. But in a meeting with farmers from Brazil and Argentina and the United States discussing this, we were scheming that if Brazil and Argentina said we're not going to allow, as Peru has done, any more than 10 or 15% of our export earnings to be resent to the banks, that David Rockefeller and his friends would get busy raising the world prices of corn and wheat and other commodities to in fact increase what they would be paid back. And so we've begun now to see, not necessarily that we'll ever pull that off, but that there are ways that we can interrelate the strategies of farmers here to get out of their crisis with the strategies and whole countries of other regions trying to get out of their crisis.
Max, you have a question?
I live in a metropolitan area. What can I do, Mark? Who's doing what, and how can we get involved? And I appreciate the presentations, but what would you recommend? Who's doing what, and how can we get involved with that process?
For those people sitting in the room, for one thing is reading yourself and getting more information, and I would recommend grabbing both all the materials that are in the back, but also those materials lead you to groups who are doing work. The Institute in San Francisco, in terms of information, work on Central America, and a lot of other issues, and resources which can guide you to organizations in your regions. For those of you, particularly in the Midwest region and interested in the policy and some of the other work, the League of Rural Voters, which published this little booklet, and I think if the address is on the inside. Within each state, there are active farm groups and active rural community groups working on agricultural policy, which then have link-ups with urban-based support groups and others. Those groups also have information and literature and materials for local meetings, slideshows, but more importantly, they are alerting citizens who care when there is a need for a letter or a phone call, because in beginning to move policy, we're going to find that those congressmen and senators from the rural areas who sit on the agricultural committees are in fact the greatest target for the corporations to lobby. You know, there's only 40 guys on the agricultural committee, so if you're the corporations, all you have to do is pump a lot of money into 40 people and you can control the policy. That means that it's the congressmen and senators who represent more urban, suburban districts who the corporations aren't necessarily watching out for, who we have to reach, begin talking to them about the lunacy of the policy. For example, the Black Caucus in Congress has been the #1 force in moving new policy and pushing it, and that's, you know, an example of the kind of folks who understand oppression and injustice and understand how the system's kicking everybody's behind and are willing to take the leadership. And so contacting the Institute and in terms of education and materials, and also getting leads to groups in your area, and contacting the League of Rural Voters to find out who in your region is working on policy work and how you might get slideshows, materials. And of course, the National Council of Churches, all the different agencies Mary Ellen's involved with in your own denomination at the national and adjudicatory level. There are many people involved, and I think doing effective action. And it's being in touch with one person. It's like a string. It will lead you into probably more work and activity than you ever really wanted.
Are there any other questions from any of you? Yes, go right ahead.
I don't believe I have a question, but I have a statement, I think, regarding what the gentleman just asked about, what can we do, and so on.
All right.
First of all, as coming from the Archie Bunker generation, in contrast to your generation, I'm impressed I've been saved from the Archie Bunkers and have joined your generation in my attitude. But also know that if we expect to do some things of substance here that you suggest, and I endorse it completely, we have to start with ourselves to prepare to give up some of our benefits that we enjoy on the backs of the poor. You referred to the great multinational church corporation, which it is. Much of our church's well-to-do-ness comes from the corporate profits. If the church is going to speak to the corporations, they better prepare to cut back on some of the income. The pension which I draw from my church, income from it is largely from billions of dollars worth of stocks held in these nasty multinational corporations. What I'm saying is we sitting in this room, if we really mean what we say, have to be ready also to suffer some of the things we've taken for granted in the past.